Hey everybody, welcome back to Pristine Podcast. My name is Lero, and in this video we're going to talk about podcast directories. The first thing we need to understand is what are directories, and to better understand it, I've come up with a good analogy. Say you have a farm where you produce cucumbers, like cucumbers are your specialty. To sell these cucumbers to people, you need to take them into the city's vegetable market, right? Because your farm is somewhere far away in the village. At the market there will be a few people, but mainly other shops who want to load their trucks with your cucumbers to populate their aisles. And then people will see your cucumbers and potentially buy them in their preferred shop without having to come at your farm. In this analogy, the cucumbers are your podcast episodes, vegetable market is the podcast hosting provider, and the shops are the podcast directories. So just like you'd produce your cucumbers in the farm, you're going to produce your podcast episodes in your studio. And just like you'd send your cucumbers in the vegetable market, you're going to send your podcast episodes in your podcast hosting provider. For you guys who don't know what a podcast hosting provider is, it's just an online space that you set up for the first time with all of your podcast details, and then you upload your podcast to in the future. And then, just like in a cucumber analogy where the shop owners come to the vegetable market to see if you have any new cucumbers for them to buy and to put in their aisles in their store, the podcast directories check your podcast hosting provider to see if you have any new podcast episodes for them to pick up and put in their site. There is no downside to register your podcast to as many directories as you can, so that different people using different directories will have it way more accessible to just log into their preferred one and check out your podcast. Now, in a time scale from the beginning where you have the idea of having a podcast all the way to the end where you launch your podcast, registering your podcast to all these different directories is the last thing you need to do just before you launch. Here I am in the back end of one of our clients' podcast hosting provider, which is called Libsyn. In the Libsyn's case, you can find this menu that I'm talking about under settings and then edit show settings, but whatever podcast hosting provider you end up choosing, it should be similarly named and similarly placed. Now when you get here, besides the required fields, which obviously need filling, such as the name, the description, the website address and stuff like that, there's 3 other important things you should keep in mind that are super important when you submit your application to Apple Podcasts and other directories. The first thing is that in the show category section, be sure to fill at least one category so that Apple Podcasts and other directories know where to place your podcast in. When people discover new podcasts to listen to, they often click the categories to see, if they're interested in parenting, they will select parenting and they'll see what's ranking, they will listen to whatever they like. So be sure to select at least one, but preferably 3 if your podcast hosting provider gives the option to do that. The second thing that's very important is the artwork. Now the artwork, what's recommended here in Libsyn is 1400 by 1400, but it should ideally be 3000 by 3000 so that it's a decently high quality. And the third important thing, guys, to do before you submit to Apple Podcasts and to other directories is to have at least one episode out there. Now, as we've talked in other videos, you should have at least 10 or 20 preferably. Since you're launching, people can spend lots of time and it will trigger the algorithm, you will be highly ranked. But if you didn't have time to do lots of episodes, you should at least have one. Now, the trailer counts as an episode, so if you're describing your podcast, what your podcast is about and stuff like that, that counts as an episode. It's usually called episode number 0. And at least have that so that when you apply to Apple Podcasts, they can take a listen and see if it's legit or not. According to Chartable, Apple Podcasts is the undisputable king when it comes to podcast directories, in comparison to Spotify, which by the way is in the second place. The difference is huge. There's more than twice the amount of unique listeners, and in comparison to downloads, the difference is insane. So in fact, it's so significant that people say if you're not in Apple Podcasts, you're not podcasting at all. So I'd recommend you to first apply in Apple Podcasts and then do these other directories. Now, other significant directories are Spotify, of course, since it's here, is the second place, but other ones are Castbox and Google Podcasts that are decently sized, even though Castbox has more unique devices than Google Podcasts. Google Podcasts, I would say, is even more important because it helps you in the ranking algorithms since it's Google, right? So if you're doing well, you'll be ranked higher, you'll get more attention. As we talked about it earlier, the more directories you apply your podcast to, the better, so do as many as you can. So after you fill all the information that you need in your podcast hosting provider and you're ready to apply to Apple Podcasts, you should go to Apple Podcast Connect or podcastconnect.apple.com, and then you need your Apple ID to log in. But once you do, you'll find this screen. This is an article from Libsyn that shows you how to do it. But yeah, so here you'll see just a simple screen where all you need to fill in is the RSS feed of your podcast, and then just press validate. In order to find your RSS feed in Libsyn's case, for example, you need to go under destinations and then edit or view existing, and then you will see your RSS feed down here. After you've sent your application for approval, you need to wait for about 2 days before Apple gets back to you. Now, we've had some clients that have had to wait for more than a week, so I would advise you to leave a 2-week period before you launch to have enough time to register your podcast in all these directories, so that there's no surprises. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to press the thumbs up and subscribe button for more podcast related content in the future. I'll see you again in the next video.